We have 2 more plenary sessions on the agenda for you this afternoon, and this next one is especially topical. We are going to be talking about geopolitics because, of course, the two topics are very much intertwined. In fact, by the end of this year, half of the world's population will have gone through an election. And I know a lot of oxygen is taken up by what's going on south of the border in the US, but really think about that. Half of the population will be changing governments by the end of 2024. So to help navigate these geopolitical complexities as it relates to the mission of Principles of Responsible Investing, please give a warm welcome to geopolitical strategist Tina Fordham as she shares her thoughts on the geopolitical risk supercycle.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming to this discussion. First thing I want to say, just to clear it up from the outset, is geopolitics is not the news. I think that there is a real sense of confusion about how to think about geopolitics because it hasn't been much of a force during most of our professional lifetimes. And there's a bit of conflating it with following the news, keeping up with the news. So we're going to talk about what that means. And mainly we're going to talk about the state of the world. As everyone knows by now, in 2024, almost half of the world's population will go to the polls, and we also have a number of conflicts going on. But what we may not be as used to as we now need to be is for how that impacts how we all do our work. So just to start off with, I think you have Slido. We're going to get a little bit of audience participation, and this is a question that I always ask at these events, and I've had some very interesting and surprising responses. So I understand we have people from 48 different countries here. All of you are working in your various ways to improve the world. Do we think the world is better now than it's ever been, or worse now than it's ever been? I think you can use your Slido to vote. What I don't know is if we're going to get the results up here. The most surprising occasion where I asked this question also was an environmental phenomenal. Okay, we're going to be 50-50. Was a conference in Norway about sustainability, where most of the participants had arrived on their private planes because they were doing very well. What happened to the results? Go back. Anyway, the Norwegian audience was the most pessimistic I'd ever spoken to. And if you know your data, like most of you I'm sure do, Scandinavian countries are supposed to have it all figured out. Can we get the results back up, or did I miss the boat? About the same. I didn't give that option about the same. That's the cop-out option. I like to make people choose between binary outcomes because, as you see, adding the about the same option gives us a tie. I would like you to think about that question a little bit. We can come back to it if you want to, because I think the way that we answer that has a lot to do with our approach to thinking about where we are in the world. Because what I would say is, as someone who looks at a lot of data, the world is better now than it's ever been by just about every indicator that we can look at, whether it's the Human Development Indicator that the UN produces, literacy, access to clean water and healthcare, even poverty levels, much improved. But the fact is that particularly in the rich industrialized world, people have become more pessimistic about the state of the world. And that's why this question is interesting. We'll talk more, and I'll give you a sense of what I mean. So geopolitics, it's everywhere, everything, all at once, or so it feels like. As I started out by saying, geopolitics is not the news, it's not current affairs. My training is as a political scientist, and geopolitics, the definition of it is what states do to project power beyond their borders. In political science, everything's about power. In economics, everything's about money. And we would argue that power first, and then the money comes, and economists would put it the other way around. So when we're talking about geopolitics and geopolitical power, what we really mean are the things that countries use, whether it's espionage or cyber attacks or conventional warfare or sanctions or tariffs, etc., to project power beyond their borders. Now, it may not be very often that Vladimir Lenin is invoked in a conference hall with over 1,000 investors, but this quote from Lenin came back to me from my studies in the olden days, post-Soviet studies. There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. And that's what this year has really felt like, that there has been this incredible pace of events, and yet in many ways, we're not seeing much change actually registering yet. I like to put this slide up to remind us when we're thinking about the pace of change, about just how much has happened in the last 20 or so years. Because in my business, I'm now an advisor to boards in the C-suite mainly. One of the most frequent questions that I get is, when are things going back to normal? I bet a lot of you in your chit-chat, small talk conversations have been saying, well, we just got to get the US elections out of the way and then we can figure everything out. So when is this back to normal that we're talking about? Right? Because the global financial crisis was in 2008 to 2009, and as many of us will remember, was a once-in-a-generation financial crisis, Eurozone crisis as well. COVID-19, again, once in a generation, at least we hope, pandemic. And then the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the first time, and I want to underscore this point, since World War II, that another country had violated a sovereign country's borders. So each of these crises, when they emerged onto the scene, was characterized as a black swan event that nobody could have known was happening and nobody could have prepared for. But that is not true. They did not come from out of nowhere, right? I was working in a large financial institution in the run-up to the global financial crisis and looking at the kinds of assets and liabilities that were on the books and thinking other people must understand them because it didn't make sense to me. COVID-19, many of you have probably been to Davos. I spoke at Davos every year, and the epidemiologists who were warning about pandemics were ignored. People just thought that couldn't possibly happen. And also, it was a bit boring, right? No one really wanted to go and hear a presentation about pandemics, global pandemics, and how they could transpire. And then the Russian invasion, something that I had been talking to my clients about, and almost every single business leader I spoke to said some variation of, that won't happen, it would be economic suicide for Russia, Putin is just trying to drive up oil prices. So I've got 2 points that I'm making here. One is, this going back to normal would have to have been a very long time ago, because we have, any senior investor and business leader has been contending with once-in-a-generation crisis after once-in-a-generation crisis for quite some time. The other point is, we can't let ourselves off the hook anymore about black swan events and once-in-a-generation events. We've actually got to pay more attention to the data points as they come together. And that means moving away from being the subject matter specialists that we were all trained as to being a little bit more familiar with the macro. So this is my thesis, the geopolitical risk supercycle, which I wrote about for Forbes 18 months ago, before the crisis in the Middle East spiked. And remember, before October 7th, just a few weeks before, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, said that the Middle East was the most peaceful it had been for 20 years. Just in terms of lagging indicators. This is empirically based. You can have a look at the article if you want to, but the graphic representation is what I use to illustrate the point that we're entering a decade of dislocation. That doesn't mean a depression or a recession, and I don't even necessarily mean that we're reaching a tipping point this year. But if we break it down into the risk drivers, which are different from risk events, the risk drivers are kind of themes like there are more conflicts. The International Crisis Group tracks them. Since 2012, we've been seeing a steady increase in the number of conflicts, the duration, cross-border, the number of deaths and everything else. This is a fact, this is data-driven, there are more conflicts. Climate change, very well known to this audience, of course, but the way that I think about it in my work is how climate change tends to drive migration. It also is a driver in those conflicts that I just mentioned. Another risk driver is declining trust, and that makes confrontation more likely. So there are more of these drivers. Those are the kinds of things I mean. And at the same time, the buffers, the international institutions, the global diplomacy, and probably most important of all, central banks, which provide liquidity that masks geopolitical risk, are all a bit weaker than they used to be. So we shouldn't be surprised that we see more disruptions. Only some of these are market moving, like it's taken a year before the conflict in the Middle East started to see some impact on oil prices. But we should expect more of these. And unless we invest in the buffers and the mitigating factors, on the one hand, and pay more attention to the drivers, we should expect more disruptions. Among these, and this is something that's really hard to quantify, so you won't see it in traditional investment research, is the changing international system. Some people talk about this in terms of the rise of the global south. I'm not a fan of that term myself. I'm not quite sure what it means. Rising middle powers is another. That's my preferred term. But it's a challenge to the dominance of the G7 industrialized countries, and it means something different from the G20 as well. But among the implications of this, and it's the implications that investors are interested in, is more challenges to the rules of the game, more competition for power, hence our discussion about what geopolitics is, things that states do to project power, and a little bit more confusion, but also as more countries look to increase their weight in the international system, and if they haven't had much practice, they might make missteps, they might miscalculate, and that's another consequence. So the changing international system may well be more fair in contrast to the post-war order, but for investors, it almost certainly means more disruption. I would say that change is inevitable. This is a snapshot here of how I think about the intersection between geopolitics and markets. This is my niche. There aren't very many people who are focused on this, but I produce the Geopolitics Navigator monthly in collaboration with the London Stock Exchange, and it's free, so you can sign up to receive it. And what I do is to kind of plot the geopolitical risks that I think are most likely to move markets along this trajectory of priced in and systemic. I think we still have more disruption or volatility to come from the US elections. We are seeing conflict escalation in the Middle East finally start to impact prices. We're seeing conflict escalation in Ukraine also, although that isn't having a similar impact. You could argue that there, in a way, the conflict escalation in the Middle East actually provides some cover for Russia in Ukraine. And then what I call gray zone ops. Now, for people who are more economic determinists who might say countries don't want to go to war, true, they don't want to go to war, but they certainly want to undermine and degrade the capacity of their adversary. And they do that through what the military calls gray zone ops. So there is a lot between war and peace. And if this isn't cheering you up, I don't know what will. Let's go to the US. As you might have guessed from my accent, I'm originally from the United States, but I have lived outside of my country for most of the last almost 30 years. So I like to think I look at it through kind of outsider's eyes. This US election, every time, I mean, this is the 5th one I've covered professionally. Every 4 years, we say this is the most impactful US election of our lifetimes. And we mean it. And yet this one really feels that way. It does feel much more consequential. And certainly up until about August, the pace of change was extremely rapid from that fateful debate in June, where President Biden kind of crystallized everybody's worst fears, followed by the failed assassination attempt on Donald Trump and the Republican National Convention, Harris's elevation to the ticket. We had a lot of action, and now we are where we are. Now, you may not need me to spell out why who wins matters, but I talk to a lot of investors who are solely focused on the Security and Exchange Commission, corporate tax, and crypto. So I do like to remind people that there are quite a lot of things on the ballot for domestic voters that matter. But again, in the 5 elections that I've covered professionally, I never remember there being such a divergence between the policy positions of the candidates. And something that I often tell my fellow Americans, particularly again on Wall Street, is where I am based in Europe and talking to mainly non-US investors as my client base, fear of a return of Trump to the White House, regardless of that individual's political persuasion, is at the top of the list. I don't think Americans understand that the sense of US reliability as an ally for many in the world, this is particularly true in the security sense, is kind of keeping the whole world awake at night. And yet, of course, Americans will cast their votes based on what matters most to them. But out of all of the wild cards that may yet transpire, I will make one point about the number of kind of points of flux, and that is that it's unlikely that we'll have a clear answer on the morning of November 6th. I've brought together a little bit of polling highlights to share with you if you've managed to avoid confronting the numbers, but in a race as close as this, it actually increases the likelihood of a dispute. And so from a business planning or strategy perspective, unless, and this also can't be ruled out, unless there is a polling error such that one or the other candidate basically sweeps to victory with a strong majority, because we don't have that now, we are looking at recounts, delays, challenges, protests, and possibly, but we hope not, worse. The stakes are very high, to say the least. After the disputed 2020 elections, state election officials took a lot of steps to try to reduce the likelihood of these kinds of challenges. But you might have seen that the state of Georgia, for example, passed a law that the votes in that state will have to be hand counted. That might take a while. You're supposed to laugh. And we can only use our imaginations to wonder why they want to hand count those votes, given what happened in the state of Georgia last time. A few just tips if you do want to look at the polls. Always look at averages of polls. If a single poll is an outlier, there's usually a good reason for that. I use the Real Clear Politics national average, where they only include so-called high-quality polls. There is a difference, of course, between polls and models. So if you look at Nate Silver, for example, he has a model, and he has indicators which are weighted, and all of that's untransparent. What I would also like to say to you is, prediction markets, the political betting markets are not better. They are not more accurate. They are easily gamed and manipulated. And, you know, for fun, sure, but I remember in trade in 2004 kind of moving violently, and a lot of Wall Street investors thinking that there was some kind of inside information going on. I just would really take that with a grain of salt. I also have for you here the direction of the country, and that's a classic question from Gallup. I think they've been asking it since the 1950s. That's a terrible number, country on the wrong track, 61.3 for an incumbent. But what we have is such a mix right now of factors, right? Inflation's going down, unemployment levels are low, growth, you know, by European standards, the US is growing at 2.5 points, miraculous, amazing, and people's views are still all over the shop. The man says, I need to finish. You don't want me to finish. You want me to tell you who's going to win, but I'm not going to tell you that. Now, this is the part where I tell you, just because the polls are very close and there's a likelihood of dispute and the stakes are very high and there really are more wars and disagreements, that is not to say that the world is coming to an end. It's just becoming more like the way it's always been. And we need to remember that the period between the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2007, that period, 89, 2007, was the most peaceful and prosperous period in all of human history, right? So extrapolating that to the future is probably what the mistake is. What do? We all need to become zeitgeist leaders. This wheel is based on a study that the Harvard Business Review published about 15 years ago. And what I liked about it, just the one sentence takeaway, is the paper evaluated the most successful corporate leaders, the most successful CEOs of all time. And what it concluded was that the most successful CEOs were not those that had launched the best product or presided over the biggest profits, but the leaders that had managed to guide their organization through the times that they're living in. And I think our challenge is to become zeitgeist leaders, if not zeitgeist, you know, parents and school board governors and everything else, because we are living through times that are more turbulent than what we grew up with. Yeah.
The conversation.
This is the last slide.
Oh,
I've
great,
never been shoved off the stage before. And also what you normally would do is have the timing there, which was not turned on.
It's not turned on. I'll take that away and I'll come back after the slide.
So you ruined my ending, which was the optimistic part. Fortune favors the brave and chance favors the prepared mind. That's Louis Pasteur, the French scientist. In order not to get too kind of deer in the headlights about the bad things that happen and freeze, which is what we normally do, we need to cast our minds over a wider range of possibilities and not do what a lot of people do when they hear these things and say, well, that's depressing. Pragmatism. Right, so we're now going to follow up with Fireside Chat, apparently, and it's going to be for 4 minutes and 58 seconds.
Well, as Tina just said, we're going to have a very robust, quick fireside chat. To do that, Wendy Cromwell, Vice Chair of Wellington Management, joining to discuss how you apply all of the risks she beautifully lined out to the ESG landscape.
Oh, right. Are we having a little dance?
Hi, everybody. So we have more time with Tina, not to be concerned, but we'll get to some investable conclusions and some themes to apply to your daily work. So I'm going to skip question one. We've done some prep, but I'm going to skip question one, go straight to question two. Tina has advocated for adding a new G to ESG, so ESGG, ESG squared. I don't know, you guys can come up with it, but that would be geopolitics. And specifically, some of the themes you highlight in your remarks, which aspects of the current geopolitical outlook might impact the outlook for ESG?
Right. Well, first of all, I think all investors have to be concerned with the macro environment, and that's part of what I was trying to get across. We would all like to understand what's most relevant for our nation, for our world, but I'm kind of suggesting we have to unlearn a lot of what we were taught at business school, which is people act in their rational economic self-interest, for example. I think that we need mental maps of where the world is headed and to kind of challenge some preconceptions about, for example, growth equals stability. And so that's the first point that I would make. Another aspect of thinking about geopolitics as it influences the way that we all do our work is this, and we saw it during the pandemic. You know, governments can usually only deal with one big problem at a time. And one of the things that I've been thinking about in preparation for this conference and this discussion is how an environment more influenced by polarization and populism, where particularly I can see this in Europe, where far-right parties and right-wing parties are exploiting, frankly, people's sense of discomfort about the pace of change, and they're looping in green policies with that. How do we deal with that? This was something, you know, I live in London, in the UK with Brexit. You had these kind of strange political bedfellows coming together, and it's a bit alarming. So in Germany, you might have seen the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland do very, very well. This is not a right-wing party. This is a neo-Nazi party led by neo-Nazi leader. But one reason they managed to do well with the vote is something so prosaic, is to push back on the green policies, and the Green Party in Germany is very popular, which was changing boilers, right? That annoyed people, those laws, changing boilers. If we look at the hurricanes in the United States, I was absolutely astonished by a study, a survey rather, that talked to people who had been personally affected by climate change events, whether they would be willing to pay a $10 surcharge to invest in a fund. And overwhelmingly, they said no. So, you know, I am looking at this through a political scientist viewpoint, but these are the kinds of things that worry me. How can we incentivize people to make choices that are in their own self-interests, if it might cost them in small ways? So, I mean, yes, this has kept me up at night.
You know, it's so interesting that you say that. We've focused a lot on climate adaptation and what is it going to take to get people to act differently. But what I thought you were going to say when I asked this question about the themes was great power competition and thinking about US versus China or West versus East. That's another area that we focused a lot on. And in fact, there were a couple of good studies last year, one by the IMF and one by the WTO. And I encourage you all to read them because the IMF goes so far as to say, if we decouple, which we are deglobalizing,
Right.
and we run a scenario where the West aligns, they basically put people into two geopolitical groups. One, if you voted in support of Ukraine at the UN, and one, if you voted against that or for the war.
Individuals or countries by
Countries,
majority?
countries.
Interesting. Okay.
And they put them into two groups, and then they look at the supply chains and it's not a scenario that is um, bulletproof for sure. It's highly stylized, but then they work through all of the ramifications of that: higher commodity prices, more price volatility, slower transition, higher cost to energy transition. One of the interesting things that may not actually play out is they actually say that that Western group, the Western geopolitical group, if they break down along those lines, has access to the minerals, but they don't have access to the processing.
Yeah.
And the Eastern group has
So
access
it's like
to the pricing.
friendshoring writ large.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So I euphemistically kind of addressed that in the slide about the changing international system. And I'm usually asked about the BRICS specifically, but that sounds like an even more valuable way of thinking about it. But we have to remember that between those groups, so most importantly between India and China, for example, is a bitter rivalry. But it's part of the changing rules of the game and the difficulty in anticipating how these relationships will go. That is something that is quite new.
So because we're 30 days, 29 days from the election, and that is the top question that we get, maybe it's because I'm American, what's going to happen?
It's the top question I get from my non-US clients, so everyone's focused.
Trump versus Harris, what might, what are the geopolitical implications? And then what might be the impact on investors?
I mean, I give long briefing sessions on just this question. What are the geopolitical implications of the US elections? But as you have seen, we're on a tight timetable, and I will not be treating you to those those longer thoughts.
Find Tina at the break.
Well, follow me on LinkedIn because there's a lot to say on this, and I don't blame people for not wanting to think a lot about politics. I'm going to need to spend about a week forest bathing or something after this election because the toxicity from having to follow the rhetoric is really quite terrible. But on a very practical level, I think under either a Harris or a Trump government, the difficulties with China will continue. I mean, it happens that mistrust of China and the desire to be tough on China is one of the few bipartisan issues in the United States. Of course, it's always a question of tone and tenor. We've seen Trump with his tariff suggestions. He's done it before. Would he do it again? I think it's something he's quite passionate about. And he thinks it works. He thinks that that other countries' imports detract from U.S. GDP. These are two huge areas. When it comes to some of the conflicts that we're contending with right now, the news broke today from Bob Woodward's book that apparently Trump spoke to Putin 7 times privately since he left office. What is their relationship and what would it mean, especially for Europe? And I can't emphasize enough how in Europe this war is on our doorstep. If the US ends its aid for Ukraine, personally, I don't think that would mean just an end to the war and peace on earth. I think that it would empower Russia to do what it might want to do in other states with borders that it doesn't consider to be valid. So, in a nutshell, I'm not just sure I would say that Harris represents continuity with Biden, but probably with the post-war United States that most people have been used to. And Trump wants to do something different. So we should expect that he would do something different and challenge the global order. The US is already in one of its periodic isolationist moods. This has always been the case. We go through, peaks and valleys on that. And I think we should take Trump at his word on mainly on what he's promising. What do you think?
Well, I think so too, except there's been a lot of rhetoric about...
There's no free lunch, You can't just ask all the questions when you're as experienced as Wendy is.
There's been a lot of rhetoric from Trump and from some of the Republicans that they would repeal the IRA. I think there's probably, most people are in the audience are familiar with the fact that it's a difficult bill to repeal. The 45X tax credits actually give you incentives to build, it's a just transition bill, if you will, to build your clean energy manufacturing plant in a traditional energy community, which means you're building the battery plant next to the oil field. And so it's creating that incentive not to repeal the bill. So we don't think that the IRA goes away, but then you start looking at where
You
the
think that Trump keeps the IRA on and calls it something else?
I think he keeps
Rebrands?
I think it's like Obamacare, like
Yeah.
they tried to
Yes.
do the
I
ACA.
consider that good news. I mean, it has created a lot of jobs, and
Yes.
yes.
Yes, and then we thought for a second there were a lot of bills introduced about repealing the EV part of it. Now he's best friends with Elon Musk, so maybe those are safe. And then we looked at there was a lot of jargon. We watched their jargon a lot about wind and being anti-wind, and we just saw the
Doesn't
deal.
the refrigerator go off if it's not windy?
Well, we
That's
saw
what Trump
this.
said. That's not what I think. I'm just
We saw that the Microsoft, this is going to sound disjointed, but the Microsoft Constellation Energy deal on nuclear relies on the exact same ITC, investment tax credit, that wind relies on. So if they're going to get rid of the ITC, they're going to have to repeal and rewrite that one section, and it also feels unlikely. So that part feels safe. But the thing that I am excited about, that I think you probably get something like this with a Harris administration, and you probably don't with a Trump administration, is there's been more in government circles, more discussion about a Marshall Plan for clean energy. So post World War II, grants to Europe to rebuild, the same idea is here, grants to developing economies to our allies
Yep.
to help them transition, to help them build new technologies, to invest. And that's what we always are grappling with here at the PRI is how does EM transition, and how do we support that? And that seems like it's starting to take shape in
That's
political
really
circles.
interesting. So I did say when I showed the slide with the silver linings that I thought that we would get to that. And that's, I mean, you have to believe that policy can work, right? That it's not, I mean, politics and policy are not the same thing for a reason. The IRA initially annoyed Europe, but then it started kind of getting into the act. And so in the best outcome for US elections, we we see people, we see democracy working and institutions continuing. And that demonstration effect goes around the world, and that good policies like this, if others copy them, then that's a great thing.
Let's end on that cheery note. Help me thank Tina. Thank you for your insights.
Thank you very much.